Let me say that I feel immensely privileged to introduce Peter Haas, who is Emeritus Professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Peter has produced work on a number of the themes that I mentioned earlier and that will be the topics of our debates over the 3 days, and even beyond that. Research on epistemic communities, environmental policies, in the Mediterranean in particular, including also contribution to the Peace Nobel-winning climate change report. He has produced cutting-edge and ambitious work also on multi-level governance and the role of science in politics. So it is no wonder that his monographs and many edited volumes and papers have been published in the top outlets and had a truly lasting impact. In all these fields, his approach is always global. The title of the keynote lecture is International Relations and Ernst Haas and International Relations. Peter, you take the time you need, about 45 minutes. This will leave us time also after the lecture to ask questions or make comments and have a little debate after the keynote lecture. But I now give you the floor, and we very much look forward to your lecture. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction, and thanks also for inviting me. I'm enormously gratified to be here offering the keynote address at this international conference on the legacy of Ernst B. Haas and celebrating his life and work. As I'm sure you're all aware, I am his only child and son, and I wouldn't be here without him in so many ways. So, thank you, Dad, wherever you may be. In this talk, I will provide an overview of his life, beginning with how international relations shaped him, and then delve into his academic career and how he shaped international relations, and conclude with some brief musings about his legacy.
The arrow?
Yeah, the right arrow. Okay, and typically with his insights, you got to read it a few times to understand it. So there are 5 elements to the talk. First, international relations and Ernst Haas, or Ernie as I will refer to him. He was definitely shaped by his formative years in Germany. He developed a lifelong interest in nationalism and broader interests in how to curtail rogue states and change national interests. Second, Ernie and international relations. He had surprisingly little impact on the conduct of international relations and foreign policy, although he is widely cited in European integration literature and even by its practitioners. Third, IR theory in Ernie. He didn't have much interest in the isms or schisms, despite teaching a demanding and well-loved IR theory course at Cal Berkeley, which some of you may have taken. He picked and chose selectively and dismissed what didn't interest him. So he wasn't overly Lakatosian. Fourth, Ernie and IR theory. He contributed significantly to IR theory, particularly in laying the foundations of constructivism and applying constructivism to the study of global governance. And fifth, his legacy. This part is more difficult. While he is still widely cited and regarded as a foundational figure in integration studies, and to some extent constructivism, his approach, we all know, is not widely followed. Who was he? He was born in 1924 and died in 2003 from a stroke at the too early age of 79. He was a remarkable figure, in part shaped by his times, not unlike the many German Jewish emigres who shaped American IR and comparative politics so profoundly in the post-war era, including Kissinger, Eckstein, Morgenthau, Hoffman, and Hirschman. Intellectually, he seamlessly combined IR and comparative politics, and thus we may better understand his anathema to systemic theorizing, even though he worked well with his Berkeley colleague Kenneth Waltz, at least through a balance of power arrangement. Robert Cohen called him an exemplary scholar, which is pretty high praise from Bob. Ernie was also broad and deep in a way that few contemporary scholars are anymore. We can see this in the broad array of topics he investigated and contributed to theorizing about them. He added to our understanding of balance of power theory, European integration, international regimes, complexity and global governance, nationalism, the UN, and the interplay between scientific knowledge, scientists, and world order. In 1997, the American journal Foreign Affairs deemed The Uniting of Europe one of the most 50 significant books in international relations of the 20th century. Wow. I don't know if that was Foreign Affairs or Stanley Hoffman, that, if we're going to associate agency with this, but still impressive. Plus, he was gracious and irreverent, and at times ornery, as of course he could afford to be. As his students can testify, he was also a serious time miser. He only committed to working with students once they had proven themselves promising, and then he was supportive and giving. But there was a high barrier to entry. He also had his earthy and silly moments. I recall as a child, we were in London, and we, Ernie, my mother, and myself, met with David Matrani in the lobby of our hotel, some grand old decayed pile. And I recall how Ernie and my mother giggled afterwards because Matrani said that he was off to the BM after the meeting. He and my mother also delighted in their 1940s American slang, which they kept using all their lives. While loving classical music and art, of course, given his background, he had no choice, he also enjoyed some of the worst of American television, regularly watching Petticoat Junction, Gilligan's Island, and F Troop. No Dick Cavett for him. Nor was he really an intellectual. He was a curious combination of Californian and European. While being interested in ideas and culture, he really had contempt for public intellectuals and social critics. Guess who didn't subscribe to the New York Review of Books and would refer to the collection of public intellectuals who published there as Irving's? Because if you look back, a lot of them, their first name was Irving. He was wildly productive. While I haven't been able to find an authoritative CV, for he was not good at organizing his own work, nor engaging in the kind of self-promotion which most do today. He published more than 20 books and monographs and 56 articles and book chapters. At least 14 were in I.O., although many of those were when I.O. was called International Organization. Maybe that makes a difference. Constructively, it does. Several co-authored with Schmitter, 8 publications in World Politics, 3 in International Studies Quarterly, 1 in APSR, and one in Journal of Politics. He routinely threw away, or more recently, recycled all his notes and data once a piece was published, much to the dismay of intellectual historians who tried to track down the evolution of his thought. Now for more details. How IR made Ernie, small IR, in the world, not the theory about the world. His formative experience was in 1930s Germany. While he rejected an overly psychological explanation of his influences, he did recognize that growing up in a fascist and anti-Semitic environment profoundly shaped his lifelong suspicion of the state and institutions, as well as his profound commitment to the prospect of the Enlightenment and progress through reason, deliberation, and consensus formation, although not through rationality. He drew a strong distinction between reason and rationality. Curiously, or perhaps due to his experience in Nazi Germany, he remained cautious of contestation, which would only, he felt, have the effect of undermining his personal normative commitments, such as during the free speech movement and anti-Vietnam War protests in Berkeley in the late 1960s. While he was opposed to the Vietnam War, he did not think that his opposition warranted converting a university of reason to a university of activism, which again felt too much like 1930s Germany. All right. He was born in Frankfurt to assimilated German-Jewish parents, dating both their ancestries back to the 1700s Frankfurt am Main region. His father had a PhD from Heidelberg and was a museum curator at the Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt, specializing in freshwater malacology. Those are snails. And his mother managed the household. He had one sister, a Juilliard-educated concert pianist and music educator. He was bar mitzvahed by choice, so he could find out what being Jewish meant, since he was being tormented daily for being Jewish by young brown shirt thugs on his way to school. The family emigrated to Chicago in July 1938, mere months before Kristallnacht, when his father finally received a job at the Field Museum in Chicago after 5 years of looking for work, after being fired in 1933 following the adoption of the Nuremberg laws. Ernie spent 1 year at the University of Chicago and then enlisted in the U.S. Army immediately after the Pearl Harbor bombing. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, deemed him a security threat because he spoke German, but the Army also thought that he must be good at languages since he could speak German. So they deemed it appropriate to teach him Japanese so he would serve in the Japanese occupation force, which was a pretty sweet posting. He spent his wartime in Ann Arbor learning Japanese and Japanese culture and playing chess instead of physical education. Providing a lifelong lesson for him at creatively avoiding institutional obligations. The Japanese, he liked to exaggerate some of his accomplishments and presented himself as a cosmopolitan man of the world, which in many ways he was. He spoke English, German, French, and some Italian. He liked a nice Calvados, as well as good old bourbon, a good pipe, and later in his life, small Dutch Schimmelpfennig cigars. He never mentioned that he got a B in Japanese, And native German speakers tell me that while he enjoyed speaking German, he had maintained the vocabulary and slang of the precocious 14-year-old he was when he left Germany. Okay. The Japanese anecdote actually highlights two aspects of his personality. First is his need to present himself as cosmopolitan. But secondly, I realized upon further reflection, it indicates his instrumental rationality and pragmatism, as he saw no need to excel and work harder than necessary on a project to which he had no long-term commitment. In 1945, he and my mother Hildegard married. She was also a native Frankfurter whose family had emigrated to the US in 1937, and a professional painter. She designed the cover of Beyond the Nation State, something which she was pleased to have been asked to do and then hated because of the design processes at place. And that, so the cover, that should have provided an image, you may remember it's this sort of mosaic of different colors. The problem was that at that stage of printing, you made a different overlay for each color, which was incredibly difficult and painstaking to do. Her lesson was never again. They remained happily married until her death in 2002, 5 months before him. He quit the Army immediately after the war to complete his BA at Columbia and to pursue a PhD in political science at Columbia, which he defended in 1952. His dissertation, which he never published, was actually on, anybody know this? Belgian independence. He was proud that the thesis was well received by an interdisciplinary committee, as was the protocol at Columbia at the time, of lawyers, political scientists, and historians, each of whom said it could be published in their disciplinary journals. But he never published it, or anything from it. He first had a brief fill-in position at the University of Chicago, and then received an offer from UC Berkeley, Cal Berkeley, to teach the UN and international organizations. He and my mother got their driver's licenses, packed up their meager belongings into their newly purchased Henry J. Kaiser, and headed west. Not unlike the Beverly Hillbillies, I suppose. Forever, it turned out. He had a lifelong pattern of buying really bad cars until Henry J., until he finally appreciated his class interest and started driving Volvos in the 1970s. He spent his entire career at Berkeley, rising from assistant professor to an endowed chair. Curiously, Berkeley asked him to postpone his tenure decision for a year, despite the publication of The Uniting of Europe. He was able to ratchet up his position in 1973 to the Robson Chair of Political Science, following an offer from Harvard to replace Henry Kissinger. He was a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and received major research grants from the Rockefeller Foundation and the Social Science Research Council. My parents loved California, especially the fresh produce, the Chinese food, particularly at Mandarin Garden in Berkeley, where they ate frequently and where he held de facto office hours, as well as enjoying the climate, geography, and relaxed lifestyle of Berkeley. So it's no surprise that he elected to stay. Not to mention that my mother had no interest in leaving. Secondly, Ernie and IR. He had a limited impact on the world of international relations, though. Surely his work on European integration didn't tell the architects that they were already speaking prose, but it did help craft a manual for subsequent generations of Eurocrats. While primarily a theorist, he did delve into policy-relevant work when asked. He wrote 2 textbooks, the 1956 Dynamics of International Relations with Alan Whiting and Tangle of Hopes in 1969, along with various monographs critical of human rights efforts, which he felt would interfere with constructive, substantive issue linkage in the 1970s. He trained over 75 doctoral students, some of whom went on to policy land, ranging from U.S. arms control to John Ruggie's efforts channeling Ernie into global governance at the UN through the Millennium Development Goals, Global Compact, and Ruggie Principles. Ernie was involved in various workshops on the UN, the 1973 through 1975 Jackson Committee Commission on the Reorganization of the Government for Foreign Policy, and the 1995 UN Commission on Global Governance report, Our Global Neighborhood. IR theory and Ernie. He was generally skeptical and unimpressed by IR theory and what we now refer to as the isms. His preferred pragmatic epistemology, as it appeared in the 1980s and 1990s, was to reject parsimony and reductionism. His IR theory class at Berkeley was a tour de force where students were run through comprehensive and critical introductions to a wide array of IR theories, from liberalism to realism to dependency theory and emergent ecological thought. Through a close reading of history, he believed that there were multiple and often intersecting causes of the things we study, and that the best we could do is to focus on the various processes of world politics, drawing from IR and comparative politics. He thus parted company with Waltz for his excessive structuralism and Cohen for his commitment to rationality. Similarly, he used, but didn't have a whole lot of respect for the early empirical studies of international organizations. His distancing from the major bodies of thought may be one of the reasons he is widely cited, but not as widely used. Ernie and IR theory. His lifelong concern was the foundations for human betterment and progress. Nationalism was a scourge of world politics, and he looked for a variety of ways in which it could be tempered. He focused more on processes than outcomes, and he focused explicitly on agency, although in true Weberian fashion, processes were associated probabilistically with discrete outcomes. Normatively, he focused on what he regarded as progressive outcomes: human betterment, economic development, and the peaceful resolution of conflict. His notion of policy progress was replacing hard problems with politically more tractable problems. Right? So it wasn't the substance of it, it was whether or not you could get it done. He was widely acclaimed for empirically grounded, sophisticated, mid-level theorizing. Early on, he adopted state-of-the-art methodologies, believe it or not. This took the form of large note cards which could be sorted with a handheld spindle, sort of Excel without a computer. I think it came out of IBM. With a key appreciation for history, what theoretically he would include as limited path dependence and historical institutionalism, he rejected parsimony, believing that most interesting things are overdetermined and subject to multiple influences, and he also rejected rationalist assumptions in theorizing. It is not surprising that later in his career, he challenged physics envy in and by the social sciences. His work can be organized chronologically although this doesn't do full justice to the oeuvre because he would return to many topics and themes as he refined his theoretical lenses. He learned over time. So the themes are overlapping and spiral towards his theoretical enlightenment with the culmination of his work in the 2000s. The rough sequence is balance of power in the 1950s, regional integration from the late 1950s to 1975, human rights from 1970 to 1980, complexity, the problématique, and expert knowledge from 1975 to 1995, nationalism from 1995 to 2003, and pragmatic epistemology from the 1990s until 2002. His contributions started with a critical attack on balance of power theory in his 1953 World Politics piece, establishing an early constructivist critique, which wasn't widely followed, nor did I believe anybody realize that it was constructivist until much later when we had that language. And the piece was based on an internal critique of balance of power theory, noting at least 3 inconsistencies in its usage and application by theorists, practitioners, and in practice. Then, in a mark of remarkable prescience, in the late 1950s through 1975, he turned to European integration and the role of international organizations, publishing the Uniting of Europe in 1958 and Beyond the Nation State in 1964. Ultimately, he grew disenchanted or just disinterested in regional integration theory, being one of the first scholars to dismiss prematurely his own work in the 1975 obsolescence of regional integration theory. He also found that regional integration was limited to Europe, so it wasn't a generalizable theory, and that the European project appeared stalled or even at a dead end. With Hirschman, he definitely expressed a propensity to self-subversion. Who in their right mind is going to publish that their primary theory is wrong? It would seemingly be career limiting. After abandoning European integration, he moved on to new pastures, notably what was being called the problématique and what we now call global governance. He moved on to apply similar frameworks to the global level, where he grew increasingly interested in the array of low political issues. He rejected the distinction between high and low politics of arms control, human rights, technology transfer, and IOs. He recognized complexity as a global condition, and his work quickly moved to appreciate the role of scientists in steering governance and how international organizations respond to new circumstances. The hole in the hole piece and the 1975 IO special issue on technology advanced the study of technology, international regimes, and the systemic study of what had been consigned to the category of low politics. All right. A sign of understanding the hole in the hole piece, which, to be honest, I must have read 3 or 4 times till I think I really understood it, and I probably really understood it only because I had read everything which he was citing, so I knew where it was coming from. But a sign of understanding the piece is being able to know whether or not it is a W hole in the hole or a H hole in the hole.
Holy moly.
There you go. Yeah, holy guacamole. In 1980, he published Why Collaborate, arguing that complexity requires substantive linkages between issues and arguing that it is only likely to occur with the diplomatic involvement of experts. His approach to complexity and the problématique was to focus on knowledge. In 1987, he published an empirical study of scientists' beliefs about complexity and the scientists' presumptive agendas in Scientists and World Order. Shortly thereafter, he came out with When Knowledge is Power in 1990, arguing systematically that IOs can learn when they have a particular design, something he and I reiterated in our 1995 piece, Learning to Learn, initially commissioned as a background paper by the Commission on Global Governance, largely, I think, because Peter Haas, the director of the commission, thought that it would be cute to commission a paper from a father-son team. While the field generally evolved into IPE studies of interdependence, he focused instead on the mental array by which analysts and practitioners understood these new challenges and which challenges required concurrent or linked or coupled governance. Not all issues could be equally addressed, so he addressed the H hole in the W hole. He then looked at two ideal types of response to complexity: tactical and substantive issue linkage with scientists, later epistemic communities, playing an active role in articulating the nature of the challenges for decision makers. With John Ruggie, he laid out a taxonomy of IOs capable of the challenge in the Jackson Report on the Government, and also challenged the Carter human rights doctrine because Ernie felt that it would undermine consensus on the substantive linkages between other global issues. So you're going to sort of contaminate dealing with the global agenda by throwing in issues on which there was not normative consensus. He started to strut his constructivist colors shortly thereafter. His 1984 Words Can Hurt You piece in the Regimes volume essentially offers a constructivist argument about the potential of regime scholarship to build consensus amongst IR theorists. This was followed by several epistemological pieces critiquing positivist and neo-positivist IR scholarship and attacking what he called physics envy, by which he meant parsimonious rationalist deductive theorizing. His final publication, Pragmatic Constructivism and the Study of International Institutions, again co-written with me, came out in 2002, just before his stroke. We argued that the best way to theorize about world politics in an increasingly globalized and complex setting requires meaningful deliberation among experts, be they academic analysts refining their understandings, and by practitioners who are made aware of academic understandings. Thus, progress could occur through a process of bargaining, or what Thomas Rissa has called arguing. Writing with him yielded a profound insight into his personality. He valued family over academic practices. Generally, when co-authoring, there's a lot of pushback and give and take between the authors. Right? It's like a good dissertation defense. You ask a question 3 different times in various forms, and you see how many iterations the student can make a good argument for. But with me, he avoided any form of conflict. He rolled over prematurely, which I found kind of disappointing. He was also pragmatic about pragmatism. Here, he turned realist about who could participate in pragmatic progress, given the underlying need for willingness to engage in a common language, or at least subject to consensual parameters for discussion. He would say that if people don't want to play nicely, they needed to be suppressed. Liberalism only applied to liberals. Liberalism could be developed through peaceful means, but its opponents needed to be eliminated or muted. His final big project, based on a graduate course he had taught for over 20 years at Berkeley, was a 2-volume comparative study of nationalism. Reviewing the experience of 13 countries from the North and South, he concluded that there are different types of nationalism. What readers call good and bad nationalism, with different patterns and outcomes in terms of national progress towards prosperity, rights, and democracy. He also concluded that there are no fixed processes and that reversals are always possible, right? So it's ideal types with dynamics. Underlying all his disparate work was a theory of progress, which he aired first in a relatively unknown 1990 piece entitled Reason and Change in International Relations for a special issue of Journal of International Affairs in honor of William T.R. Fox, edited by Robert Rothstein. Okay, right, you can't see it. That's everything you need to know about his theory of progress is right there. And what is particularly cool about that is he presents the model using 2 different languages. One is the language of sort of observable findings, telling it as a story of history. But the other is as a causal model of nationalism and change. So one is organized analytically in terms of variables and their interactions and the outcomes associated with those variables at individual points in the process. And the other is what it looks like with words which are more commonly accessible. So the title of the project, Nationalism, Liberalism, and Progress, is hardly a modest title, but it does give away the entire project. He thought and hoped that progress could occur, but it only happened occasionally and was subject to reversals. The big picture was finally systematically presented and unveiled in this final culminating project where he studied what he called the evolution of rationalization. He remained an avowedly Enlightenment man. While he thought that more rational politics might be a good thing, he spurned rationality as an assumption for theorizing. He also rejected historical institutionalism as being insufficiently theoretical, as branch points and lock-in are really largely post hoc views. Similarly, he thought that path dependence was merely a process rather than a theory. And he was profoundly dismissive of rational choice, IPE. Progress for him meant two things: improving the human condition and replacing hard policy problems with more tractable ones. This occurred gradually as new actors helped to transform state interests. In Europe, this was the decline of European interstate violence, as well as improved environmental quality, democratization, and the spread of a liberal world order, however haltingly. Thus, for him, change and liberalism may be transformative, not reformist, which differentiates him largely from Andy Moravcsik. But this process is also subject to fits and starts and not to be taken for granted. Moreover, theory itself could play a role when properly communicated to practitioners, and theorists, through constructive engagement with practitioners, could also develop new temporary consensual knowledge. Ernie's legacy. What is his legacy? He continues to be cited and recognized as a major figure of 20th century IR who contributed a distinctive epistemic perspective on world politics. He remains widely referenced and embedded in our collective understanding of world politics, yet few actively or consciously follow in his footsteps. He may be neglected, but he is not obsolete, nor is he obsolescent, for that matter. Post-death, there are still 430 citations on Web of Science. Why does he have so few followers who are willing to assume the Haasian mantle? Some of the difficulties are his ponderous writing, demanding research design, and time-intensive field work, along with rejecting simple answers. Not that people are more stupid than they used to be, but sociological changes in the field, in particular the need for fundable large N databases and multiple peer review publications, lead people to ask simple questions about outcomes and rely on methods which allow for multiple publications. And, field work to some extent is out of fashion because it just takes too long. Even though the only way you can learn meaningful things from this perspective is by talking to people. His legacy on theory is fairly simple. Be rigorous, don't take yourself too seriously, know that truth is a moving target, and recognize that most interesting things are overdetermined. He has had an impact on the conduct of politics. His general model of iterative reason under highly specified conditions was applied by Schmitter for Europe and Ruggie for the UN. John Ruggie attributes responsibility to Ernie for the Millennium Development Goals of the UN. Ruggie says that he applied Ernie's theory to build consensus around shared problems and to mobilize resources on its behalf, something Ruggie pursued further with the Ruggie principles on corporate human rights. So Ernie's model of politics was fairly simple to some extent. Expand the network of actors, including corporate and scientific. So he was all over both transnational politics, domestic politics, and the sort of global pluralism which people at least empirically described now when some try to theorize. He was always a bit ambivalent about NGOs. Mostly because he didn't think they had any legitimacy in the international domain. Keep the process moving. This is a bicycle model of politics. Stasis is death. Choose cases carefully for spillover. Avoid human rights because the issue was too contested. Use multiple spillover mechanisms, in particular persuasion and changing corporate interests. Avoid spoilers whenever possible. And be modest about the whole thing. The process is potentially reversible, and there is no teleology. We can finally ask, how would he feel about contemporary conditions? Indulge me for a moment as I channel him. He would be fearful of declining U.S. democracy, in particular the loss of independence by the judiciary. He would also be perfectly happy, I think, with a heavy-handed suppression of the far right in the U.S. and abroad, as they are unwilling to play by his liberal Enlightenment rules. He would be fearful of growing nationalism in the U.S. and elsewhere. He would be concerned about the loss of U.S. hegemony, as well as with the loss of bipartisanship at home in the U.S., and the loss of some common vision of how power should be deployed in the world. He would be pleasantly surprised at Germany's role in the liberal New World Order. He would be gobsmacked about Brexit and the silly rejection of European integration, but he might also say that British policy is not locked in, and following a period of domestic social learning, Britain may rejoin the Union, which would in fact strengthen European integration through the public rejection of its alternatives. He would be moderately hopeful about environmental governance, and he would be utterly dismayed and disinterested in the overall direction of the scholarly field of IR and its mainstream journals. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your very fascinating picture of Ernst Haas. We have now about 15 to 20 minutes for a round of questions or points, comments. Maybe let me kick off with one. You paint this picture based on a mind that values reasons, that values expertise, problem solving. You said being pragmatic about pragmatism. I mean, progress, get it done. So a mind that values science, steering governance. And on the other hand, a strong skepticism towards contestation, mass politics, nationalism, but also activism, as you mentioned when you said what you said about NGOs. So all this would point to a very apolitical man. And I want to ask about his politics. Okay, liberal and not illiberal, but even within liberalism, there are different positions, there is choice. Where was he politically?
You know, Philippe may be able to answer that better than I can, but he was a social progressive, an economic conservative, and an Obama foreign policy type. In the sense that, you want to avoid grand commitments. Politics, international politics, or foreign policy, right? There's a big difference between international politics and foreign policy. Foreign policy was really the art of the deal. And he thought that the prime goal of diplomats was avoid locking themselves in. Always maintain a plausible range of choice for the future. Because you never know when things may change and you gotta do something different. Yeah, I mean, he voted Democratic his whole life. He was not involved in politics. And sort of viewing it as a child, the biggest political impact on him, not necessarily influence, but impact, was the radicalization of Berkeley politics in the late 60s, where he was sympathetic to the goals, but he fundamentally didn't like the techniques. Right? He thought the U.S. should get out of the Vietnam War. He did not think that demonstrators should burn down buildings that were receiving money from the CIA. Because at the time he was directing an institute, and it was this terrible no-win situation for him. Was that on the one hand he felt obligated to support all the people who worked in the institute. He was dependent because he had received this from the previous director, that their primary source of funding was the CIA for doing area studies. And so at the same time, so he was concurrently trying to find new funding sources, which he ultimately did, but also not put the staff at risk. And they had to hire a security guard to protect the building because they were bomb threats. So he was following. He was well aware of the politics, but he hoped that you could finesse it.
Thank you. Philippe.
Well, I can testify personally to that. It was one of the things that made our relationship difficult at times. I was just and for him, of course, it was the memory of what had been the disruptive behavior that had taken place at the end of the Weimar Republic and led to Ernie was opposed to the war, but didn't want to do anything about it. And I was very concerned that if you didn't do something about it, and particularly if you didn't disrupt ordinary activities, and that's of course something we were doing a lot of on the Berkeley campus. And so we finally agreed to sort of not discuss these matters, and so, but I want to bring up something else. I think there's one aspect of his work, at least at the time that I knew him best, which helps you understand many of his positions. And that was his relationship to his great rival at the time, who was Karl Deutsch. So here were two German refugees.
Deutsch was Czech.
Okay, Czech, but Sudeten Czech, okay? But very German, believe me. Okay. Anyway, okay. And they knew each other well, respected each other. And in fact, one of the strange things they did was to make sure that, that his graduate students, Ernie's and Karl Deutsch's, met each other and discussed these issues. So that was, I think, quite interesting. So they respected each other, but the approaches were radically different, both in terms of methodology, evidence, etc. Karl Deutsch was primarily interested simply in manipulating numbers about who communicated with whom, and then made certain assumptions about social communication producing community, let's say. And in his case, the fascinating thing was that Karl Deutsch was a student of disintegration, but he tried to turn the theory around for integration. In other words, his earlier work was on the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he showed clearly that there were major changes in social communication which preceded the eventual collapse, of course, in large part due, of course, to World War I, which was a kind of deus ex machina, but that's something else. And Ernie was much more interested in what was going on inside the black box, not just simply the external changes and then making these assumptions, but who, in effect, was communicating and making decisions with whom. And that's where he opened up all of international relations to this, exchange between national and supranational bureaucracies. The role of interest groups, social movements, etc., all became part of his understanding. But as I say, I think to understand Ernie at that point, you have to also understand this kind of competition, but a respectful competition with Karl Deutsch, and both of them had graduate students, and we all met and argued with each other. So I met Joe Nye and Hayward Alker, and I can't remember who else, and we all debated these issues, and both Karl and Ernie insisted on this, and I think that's a particularly peculiar kind of intellectual relationship that I think maybe it should happen more often, but doesn't yet.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter, for this really amazing talk. Just a question on something that I think many of us are curious about: this, the publication of these obsolescence articles in the 70s. I think you called it privature. One might even go further and say maybe mistaken. Did you ever discuss that with him, the motivation for doing that? Did somebody try to talk him out of it? Where did this sort of categorical attitude come from?
I have no idea. I was 20 years old at the time. I don't know. I can speculate that he'd been reading too much philosophy of science. It's sort of very Popperian of him in a way.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. I have two questions. One is more general, that I was interested in knowing what his relationship and exchanges were with actually EU policymakers at the time. In a way, Jean Monnet seems to be a bit his alter ego at the policy side, and I would expect some exchange in that respect. And the other question I had is the last point you made, that he said that these integration processes are reversible and there's no teleology. Can you elaborate on that? Because I know the literature is mainly criticizing neo-functionalism in general for being too much one-directional and not foreseeing disintegration. Can you make some concrete examples where he actually challenged that approach himself?
That's what the nationalism volumes is all about. That's where it comes out. And, that it wasn't a theoretical finding, it was a purely empirical finding. That he was expecting, going into the project, more linearity over time, than he observed. I'm sorry, what was
His exchange with Jean Monnet and
I don't know. I think that he probably interviewed these people, these guys, once or twice. I don't think there was any sort of ongoing relationship, because at least the way that the Uniting of Europe was researched and written was, so I hear, I was 6 months old at the time. He had a sabbatical, or he had a research grant, and so he was in Europe for probably 6 months, and he didn't have a whole lot of money, so he and my mother rented a cottage along the Dutch coast, which I guess was nice in the summer and awful in winter. My mother was stuck there changing my diapers, and she did not have a particularly fond memory of that role. Not to mention that disposable diapers weren't widely available yet. And so my father would go to Luxembourg, interview people, and then go back and write up all his notes and maybe start doing some writing. And the only person that they ever talked about in sort of the sense of having multiple interactions with and feedback was some bureaucrat named Madeleine Ledivalec, which don't know what happened to her. But I mean, I'm not aware at all of any communication coming from the luminaries. He would have collected those sorts of things, and there was very little correspondence.
Yeah, and then we.
So I just want to thank you for a great, fascinating talk, really, to get a sense of the man and the time and the times and in the times. And so, I was just thinking on the, question about obsolescence. It seems to me this is about intellectual honesty. Isn't it? It's a sense that his approach, Philippe would say his approach, not his theory, but basically it's over and he goes on to something else. And I think that's quite wonderderfully brave.
It's utterly refreshing.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
The remarkable thing is that I'm not aware of anybody else ever having done that. So,
No.
What you call intellectual honesty is...
But it seems to me that he's more empirics driven than theory driven, and that I think makes probably all the difference. But I was going to ask you a question about where is Weber in all of this? Did he ever talk about Max Weber to you? No, but in one of the many things I read, the suggestion was he was deeply influenced in his view of ideas and interests. And interested in his rejection of historical institutionalism, I assume it's because there's an insufficient agency in there.
Right, yes, that's right. you know, I mean, like, you can, I don't remember if he probably, in the nationalism books, he must cite Weber. I mean, I think in the intro it's like, yeah, this is, you know, read Weber and then you don't need to read this. But, you know, but I'm sure that, you know, Weber was in the background for his whole career.
Maybe very quickly now, Anya, and if it's very quick,
I just wanted to point out that I thought Ernie was the most sedentary person I'd ever met. It's one question whether he ever left the city limits of Berkeley the entire time I knew him. He wouldn't go to conferences even. But he sent his students out. So Leon Lindbergh, Stu Scheingold, all of the students working on Europe, and then he sent me, of all places, to Central America and to Montevideo to interview people in the Central American Common Market and the Latin American Free Trade Area. So he sent his students to do the interviewing, but Ernie himself was very sedentary. Are we in agreement on that?
Well, that adds on quite well to that. I think to honesty and the sedentary behavior. I mean, you only introduced me briefly to him, and so I met him once on the campus at Berkeley. But I think the sheer curiosity that Ernie displayed is just absolutely amazing. And the way, I mean, he documented that when he, out of the blue, I received an email and he said, oh, I'm teaching constructivism at Berkeley using your JEP special issue. And he said, if that's constructivism, I'm a constructivist. And so, and that was in 1999, I think, or 2000. And that's how he came, he was brought on board of the social construction of Europe. So that's just a brief anecdote to add, and the impressive way that I thought he was engaging with new theories and flexible in that way.
thank you. Maybe if you like to say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, just, you know, he really didn't give a damn about the profession. And what that implied, where I'm going with that, is that, you know, to a large extent, he was always a constructivist. It's just that he was a constructivist before there was constructivism. So he would draw sort of insights which we would now call constructivist and were at odds with the prevailing approaches at the time, and then sort of the field caught up with it. And also his own thinking evolved, so it became more sophisticated. And, you know, like the big picture here is sort of a, takes the form of a helix. So you've got all of this stuff, you've got the different strands, which are what academics think, what practitioners think, what's going on in the world, and those three sort of intersect with one another. And then, you know, it's going like this, and, you know, the y-axis is time. And, you know, as a consequence of the way that the different strands in the helix develop, the world changes too.